what I've written is the phenomenal experience, right? The phenomenal experience is deposited into the passive mind of the observer. The phenomenal experience is deposited into the passive mind of the observer. Okay. Remember in the banking concept, we said that what was being transmitted is knowledge from the teacher to the student. And in that this deposit of knowledge, right? That this deposit of knowledge equals education. What Freire has done is he's been able to identify a phenomenological experience, a mode of sort of existence, right? A mode of experience within the world, a very perverted mode of experience, and we'll see what this mode of experience is. He uses from to further explain this existence. But phenomenal experience is deposited into the passive mind of the observer. And what does that mean? What does it mean to talk about that, right? Well, the first thing to recognize as far as this deposit of experience is that according to Freire, the distinction between the oppressor and the oppressed, there's an inability for the oppressor and the oppressed to make a distinction, a clear distinction between two things. And he calls it the internal and accessible consciousness. So he makes a distinction between two things, internal and accessible consciousness, right? So to be able to understand sort of the modified version of this that I'll put up in a second, we need to understand the distinction between internal and accessible consciousness. It's really not that difficult to grasp, so I'm going to go sort of slowly so that I make sure everyone gets it. Okay, imagine, if you will, that here I am sitting at a table, right? I'm sitting at a table. I'm not a good artist, right? So here's the table, and there's an object on the table, and here's my eye. Right? And I recognize that there's an object on the table. This object, in a sense, is projecting itself toward me. Right? I recognize that there's an object. There's my cell phone on the desk. Right? This object is sort of throwing itself. Right? I recognize that it has a particular shape, a particular mass, a particular color. It exists in the world as a thing. Right? So that I recognize that there is an object. So imagine that this is the content of my mind now. Right? Right. I recognize that there is something in the world, and this recognition of the thing in the world is what he classifies as accessible consciousness, right? Items of the world, things in the world, these things in the world are accessible to my consciousness, meaning that because my mind has the capacity to sort of receive these deposits in the traditional banking concept, I have the ability to take things that are accessible to my consciousness and make them internal to my consciousness. So technically speaking, this would happen first, and then this would happen second. So that which is accessible to my consciousness could become part of my consciousness, right? So things in the world which are accessible to my consciousness become internal to my consciousness. I now sort of remember this. I possess this. This seems like there's nothing wrong with this, right? This you can call the act of memory, right? We would say that this is the act of memory, right? I look at the desk. I see that my phone is on the desk. I can close my eyes and look somewhere else, and pretty much I can rest assured that if I reach my hand down at a certain distance, I can feel around and there it is. Yep, I found it without even looking, right? Because in a sense, I remembered where it was. That which was accessible to my consciousness, things in the world which are accessible to my consciousness, became internal to my consciousness. It was part of sort of my memory, and I verified that by working backwards from that which was internal to that which was accessible, right? So I just demonstrated that that's sort of obvious, and it's factual too. We know that this works. So it seems like Freire's attempt to critique this is a little, why would he want to critique this? Because I just demonstrated that it does have function in the world. The reason being, and I haven't given you enough information yet, is that we place too much emphasis on this ability to memorize, right? In pedagogy, one of the main flaws in pedagogy, according to Freire, which we'll see in a little bit, is sort of this overemphasis of memory, right? Rather than us existing in the world, what we want to do is collect information, right? We want to collect accessible consciousness and make it internal, and we have a fascination with individuals who have this amazing sort of resource of memory, right? Because you can always pull up bits of information. According to Freire, this really isn't part of education proper. There's no act of co-creation or creation in this act of memory. All that I'm doing is I'm systematically internalizing that which is accessible to me, right? I've, in a sense, transformed the external world and made my mind I've transformed the consciousness of my mind, the internal consciousness of my mind, to the external, accessible consciousness, right? My mind has become as dormant and as static as this room that I'm doing this lecture in, right? In a sense, I have to recreate this room in my mind internally to map onto the accessible consciousness of the room in order for me to do what I did before, pick up the phone. But imagine years of systematically recreating our mind, restructuring our mind so that the content of our mind is nothing more than a passive reflection of the external world. That's a mouthful. I apologize if it's a bit too technical. But what would happen to the content of my mind? My mind would be as static and as stagnant and as lifeless and as stuff in the world, as inorganic things in the world, right? And we'll see in a little bit that this is the mechanization of the mind, right? And he's going to have some problems with that. Okay. He calls, so I talked about accessible consciousness, and the quote he says for accessible consciousness are the objects that surround me, right? Those things which are given to accessible consciousness are the objects which surround me as a perceiver. Now, when we go back to our example, and we can get rid of sort of the teacher-student relationship for a second, and we can get rid of sort of the deposit of knowledge. When we're talking about the oppressor and the oppressed, right? When we're talking about the relationship between the oppressor and the oppressed, what's being deposited, right, rather than knowledge, right? And it's the same system. This banking concept is the same system, but he appropriates it differently. Is what we're attempting to do is to take the contents of my mind, and I want to impose. I, the oppressor, prescribe, right? I prescribe this imposition, and the thing that I am imposing is accessible consciousness. I want your mind to be nothing more than an object that I can manipulate, right? I want, as I can manipulate this phone, and I can do things with this phone, and I can move this phone around, and I can, there's things that I can do with this. I want to have the same, I, the oppressor, want to have the same ability to do that to your mind, right? When I say sit, you sit. It's like training a dog almost, right? It's sort of like the same concept, right? When I say sit, you sit. When I tell you what's good, you don't question me. What I say goes, right? It's my way or the highway. It's sort of these ideas, right? So what I'm attempting to do is I'm attempting to replicate, right? I'm attempting to create and replicate the accessible consciousness and transform the human mind into nothing other than one really big object for my manipulation. Just as those objects which are, and the way he quotes it is the objects that surround me, just as the objects that surround me, as I demonstrated earlier, are for the oppressor, they're only for me to manipulate, for me to have control over. So too is your mind only there for me to manipulate. And the power that I want as an oppressor is control over your mind. How do I control your mind? I control your mind by telling you that everything that I'm telling you is always right. Never challenge me. Never question what I'm saying. Never question the authority. Go with the flow. How's it go? I forget. It's like fit into the crowd or whatever. But go with the flow is sort of the idea, right? Insofar as I'm able to do that, just like I showed you in the example where I picked up the phone, what you end up doing after years and years of being habituated, being trained to adapt your mind to the static existence of the accessible world, your mind becomes accessible, right? Now I can use your mind and manipulate your mind just like I can manipulate objects, right? It doesn't have to be this sort of spooky Manchurian Candidate. It doesn't have to be, I mean, it can get that spooky, but it doesn't have to be that sort of conspiracy theory spooky at this level, right? We're not necessarily talking about the control of human subjects, though that is certainly an implication of this research. And in a sense, the real control of the human subject is to increase docility, right? We want to increase, right? We want people to be more docile. I spell that wrong, D-O-C-I-L-I-N-T. Alright, what I'm attempting to do is increase docility, right? I want these people more, to be more like the objects in the world. So just like the teacher oppresses the student by depositing knowledge, what I do is I prescribe the objectification of the human subject, right? I prescribe acts, I prescribe processes in which all you do as a human being is just memorize facts. You become nothing more than a machine. I tell you, 2 times 2 is 4, 4 times 4 is 16, and so on and so on and so on, right? So your mind becomes nothing more than a warehouse of collected data. But within the contents of your mind isn't the ability to process new or create new information. It just becomes this receptacle, this huge receptacle of deposited information. And you become, for all practical purposes, a robot, right? An automaton. Okay.